Hi, I'm Jen Renz, and I'm here. I'm going to talk to you about some books today, and this is Kruger, my faithful companion. So, first book I'm talking about is The Race to Save the Lord God Bird by Philip Hoos. Start by reading an excerpt from the book. This is a quote from Jim Tanner, who devoted his life to studying the ivory-billed woodpecker, and he once said about the bird, "The ivory-bill has frequently been described as a dweller in dark and gloomy swamps, has been associated with muck and murk, has been called a melancholy bird. It is not that at all. The ivory-bill is a dweller of the treetops and sunshine. It lives in the sun, in surroundings as bright as its own plumage. It is true that the men trying to watch and follow these birds are probably in the shade and the mud, among the fallen trees and running vines, but that does not affect the ivory-bill in the least. He stays above all that, and it is a handsome, vigorous, and graceful bird." So 150 years ago, the forests and swamps of the American South were full of the noises of wolves, panthers, insects, and birds, and no bird stood out quite like the ivory-billed woodpecker. And its distinctive kabam of the woodpecker attacking one of the ancient trees in the forest. In Philip Hoos's The Race to Save the Lord God Bird, he describes the magnificent bird and the people who devoted their lives and careers to preserving the habitat of the ivory-billed woodpecker. At 2 feet in length and a 3-foot wingspan with distinctive black and white markings, the ivory-bills were hard to miss throughout the South and the island nation of Cuba. 150 years ago, the forests and swamps of the American South were filled with the noises of wolves, panthers, insects, and birds, and no bird stood out quite like the ivory-billed woodpecker. And the distinctive kabam of the woodpecker attacking one of the ancient trees in the forest. In Philip Hoos's book, The Race to Save the Lord God Bird, he describes this magnificent bird and the people who devoted their lives and careers to preserving the habitat of the ivory-billed woodpecker. At 2 feet in length and a 3-foot wingspan and distinctive black and white markings, the ivory-bills were hard to miss throughout the South and the island nation of Cuba. But by the time James Tanner began studying the ivory-bills in the 1930s, they were confined to a remote swamp in Louisiana, and unbeknownst to Tanner, the forests of Cuba. Tanner and other early environmentalists worked tirelessly to save the ivory-billed habitat, but as demand for lumber increased and their habitat was slowly invaded, the already elusive ivory-bills became more like a ghost haunting the bayou, but never really seen. A ghost that some are convinced still haunts the forests and swamps of Louisiana and Cuba. To learn more about those who spent their lives looking for them, read Philip Hoos's The Race to Save the Lord God Bird. Martin W. Sandler's The Impossible Rescue, the true story of an amazing Arctic adventure, begins in early September of 1897, when the ice begins to freeze around whale ships in the area of the Arctic near Point Barrow, Alaska. Assuming the wind would change and blow the ice trapping their ships back out to sea, the captains were not immediately concerned, except for Captain Tilton of the Alexandra, the only ship to escape the ice, and hurriedly steamed back to San Francisco to alert the nation to the rest of the ships that were trapped at Point Barrow. The ships were well and truly trapped in the ice now, and ill-equipped for spending a winter in the Arctic. To add to the hardship, some of the ships were crushed by the ice, and sailors were forced to seek refuge on other ships and in forequarters on land. Word of the trapped ships reached President McKinley all the way back in Washington, D.C., who dispatched Captain Tuttle and his ship the Bear of the U.S. Cutter Service, a forebearer to the Coast Guard, to sail as far north as possible and then launch an overland rescue to bring food to the trapped crewmen. Captain Tuttle assigned 3 men to accomplish the rescue plan, which included traveling overland by sled and convincing Charlie Asterlock and Tom Lopp to give up the reindeer herds and help drive them north to Point Barrow to feed the stranded sailors. The men Tuttle assigned were First Lieutenant David Jarvis, Dr. Samuel Call, and Second Lieutenant Ellsworth Bertloff. There was a slim chance the men would succeed in completing the over 1,700-mile trek across the Arctic to reach the crewmen before they starved, and the whole mission was completely hopeless without the cooperation of Asterlock and Lopp. Meanwhile, the sailors had no hope of being rescued. Conditions went from bad to worse as the weather turned bleaker, food became scarcer, and the men developed scurvy. To find out if the whalers were rescued in time, read Martin W. Sandler's The Impossible Rescue. Okay, the third book I want to share is Frederick Douglass, A Noble Life by David A. Adler. I can tell you what I have seen with my own eyes, felt on my own person, and know to have occurred in my own neighborhood. I'm not from any of those states where slaves are said to be in their most degraded condition, but from Maryland, where slavery is said to exist in its mildest form. Yet I can stand here and relate atrocities which would make your blood boil at the statement of them. I lived on the plantation of Colonel Lloyd on the eastern shore of Maryland. I mention the name of this man, and also the persons who perpetrated the deeds which I am about to relate, running the risk of being hunted back into interminable bondage, for I am yet a slave. I will mention the names and glory in running the risk. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in 1818. Douglass spent most of his time as a slave working in the Baltimore home of Hugh Auld, taking care of Auld's son, and eventually working in the shipyards. Sophia Auld even taught a young Douglass to read, one of the greatest gifts bestowed on the eloquent speaker. At age 20, Douglass decided to make a run for freedom, and made it north, eventually settling in Massachusetts, where he was joined by his wife, the free woman, Anna Marie. In Massachusetts, Douglass became friends with the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who first encouraged Douglass to lecture on slavery, and later encouraged Douglass to write his narrative about his time of enslavement. But just because Douglass now lived in the North did not mean he was safe. Slave hunters who wanted to capture him and send him back into slavery in the South patrolled the North, which is why after the publication of his book, Douglass spent a year away from his family, touring Europe, before it was deemed safe for him to return home. Douglass risked much and worked tirelessly for the cause of abolition and his fellow African Americans. To learn more about Douglass and his accomplishments, check out David A. Adler's book, Frederick Douglass, A Noble Life.
Yeah, just so I have something to because you can't...
The last book I want to share tonight is The Notorious Benedict Arnold, a true story of adventure, heroism, and treachery, by Steve Shimkin. The night was dark and moonless. Each captain lit a low flame in a lantern, covered the sides of the lantern with cloth, making the faint light visible only from directly behind. One lantern was hung at the back of each boat. The men wrapped shirts around the ship's oars to muffle their sound, and very gently dipped the oars in the lake. When Colonel Edward Wigglesworth led the way, and the other captains followed in single file, each guided by the dim light on the boat ahead. Amazed and breathless as he glided past the British ships, Wigglesworth easily could hear the sailors talking, carpenters hammering. We rode out clear of the enemy without being discovered, he said. Arnold, on the Congress, was the last to leave. It was just like Benedict Arnold to take the most dangerous position in a battle, such as the naval battle just described, where the Americans escaped the British by just a hair's breadth. He was brave to a fault, experiencing several close calls during his time in the Army. Today, most know Benedict Arnold as one of America's greatest traitors. But before he was a traitor, Arnold was an American hero, working his way up to a major general in the Continental Army and helping win decisive battles during the Revolutionary War. So what was it that led this deeply patriotic and passionate man to betray his countrymen and friends? Was it because his pride was hurt from being passed over for promotion one too many times? Despite having the trust and admiration of General George Washington, who offered Arnold the honor of commanding the left wing of Washington's army, Arnold still turned his back on his country. Or perhaps his only motivation was money. Arnold had devoted much of his personal fortune to the war, and now found himself with 4 children, a new wife, and no income to support them. Discover what really drives a man to turn from a hero to a traitor in Steve Shimkin's The Notorious Benedict Arnold. Thanks for joining me. I hope you'll check out one of these great books. I know I enjoyed them.